It's a real pleasure to have everybody here this evening, and it's a real pleasure to be celebrating Heath Ceramics and American pottery, particularly to have here this evening Kathy Bailey and Robin Petravic, who are the new owners, or relatively new owners, of Heath Ceramics. They took over the company in 2003, having worked before as design consultants and designers at Nike and Motorola and other such great companies. And it's really wonderful to now see such a cherished American ceramic company in the hands of such responsible individuals who clearly care very deeply about the company. We all can attest to the great design of Heath Ceramics, having drunk and eaten off their designs upstairs. So really, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Robin and Kathy to you all, and thank them very much indeed. And of course, the occasion for this talk is the launch of the publication of the book. Complexity from Simplicity, Simplicity from Complexity. It's such a great title that I forget it, but it's certainly one that I think sums up what great design is all about anyway, that you know, the most simple or seemingly simple things are actually the most complex and sophisticated to achieve. And I think certainly Edith Heath summarizes that sort of goal so well. So, Kathy Bailey and Robin Petravic, thank you both very much.
Okay, so I've lost my voice. I'm not going to be able to say very much this evening, but I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Kathy Bailey, and this is Robin. We are the new owners of Heath Ceramics as of about 3.5 years. I work under creative direction, and Robin really runs a company, which is a much more creative job than I think either of us ever dreamed, because it's important that it survives as a business so that we're able to be creative with it and have it kind of reach our new vision. Anyway, I'm going to hand it over to Robin, and he's going to say a few things that I can't.
Do I need to use this, or use the podium? Okay. So Kathy conveniently lost her voice tonight, so it's all down to me. It's never happened before. But I want to thank you all for coming tonight. All of you are part of what a lot of things make Heath Ceramics special, and all of you are part of what makes Heath Ceramics special, and people really appreciate it. And for us who focus very much on sort of making dinnerware and tile in our local San Francisco home, it's really wonderful to come here with, this is the first book we've been involved with, and have a really big, enthusiastic audience, as opposed to my 5 best friends from college. And ironically enough, my 5 best friends from college didn't try and register until late last night, and it was sold out. So it's all true to form, of course. Kathy and I have been involved with Heath Ceramics for the past 3.5 years or so. And by this point in our lives, we pretty much have a legitimate track record of getting involved with things where we don't fully know what we're getting into or why. And, something that we sort of refer to as a 50-50 plan. 50% of the plan is extremely well planned out in very fine detail, and the other 50% is a lot of blank pages that are waiting to be filled in as things go along. The whole purpose of it is really to get started, and when you start something, it's the only way to find out how something interesting is really going to play out. And we've done that many times in personal and professional lives, and Heath Ceramics is a really perfect illustration of that process that we go through. We stumbled across Heath Ceramics literally about 4 years ago, and at the time we didn't really know what was so special about it. I mean, we knew it was very special. We knew it needed to be saved, as do many things that have been able to age as gracefully as Heath Ceramics, in order to sort of wear that cloak of importance that it does. At the time, we couldn't really pinpoint what it was that drew us to the company so strongly and made us want to be involved with it. And that's when we kind of said, well, we don't really know what it is, but we should just go for it and find out. And other than the fact that there were some beautiful designs, some beautiful classic glazes, we didn't totally understand the depth and breadth of the specialness of this place. We work there every day now for about 3.5 years, and every day we've been able to broaden our depth and appreciation for the place beyond just the products and the designs that come out of there. And that goes from Edith Heath herself and understanding what was important about the way that she did things, to the people that have, some of them working. We have a 40th anniversary of employment next week when we get back to San Francisco. So the people that make all the products. And then the importance of a designer manufacturer, something that wasn't really part of our generation, but was a generation of when was part of the generation of designers when Heath Ceramics was started. The importance of a designer manufacturer and what it really adds to a society, to a local economy, to a local community. So, since that said, in the past 3.5 years that we have been involved with Heath and running the company and creating new designs and bringing back old ones, we've really grown tremendously, more than any other period in our lives, as designers, as employers, and as really vocal advocates of craft in our community and of local manufacturing, all these things that are not necessarily directly associated at face value with design and products. So that's kind of what we've been through. And we're able to sort of learn and absorb all these things while working on projects and being there in our factory every single day, as well as working with people on the outside who are able to sort of bring in that outsider looking in perspective that helps broaden our perspective. And people like that you're going to hear from tonight, like Garth Clark and the other contributors to the book, have been very, very important in that process. So a little bit about the process of the book. During the process of its creation, we were being sent essays from the contributors that were writing about Heath Ceramics, and as they basically were written. And it was absolutely fascinating to find out all these things about this company where we were spending every day that we had no idea about. We were really learning it. And that ranges from simple historic facts about the place to the meaning that Heath Ceramics held for people back in its early days, and the meaning that it was starting to hold for people again today in current times. So in short, it was really quite remarkable to very quickly discover what a strong community there was around this company, around Edith Heath and the work that she had done, and to discover that in this community there were so many very passionate and visionary people, such as the people that contributed to this book, which came out wonderfully, and especially in particular the Amos, Garth, and Adam that are here tonight with us, that we're going to be hearing from a little bit later. I'll also say that from the very beginning, when Amos first approached us with this idea of putting the book together, it has been an incredibly simple and natural process to put this book together. What I think was really remarkable about the whole thing was that not once did we ever find ourselves saying to anybody, the designer or Amos, in putting this book together, we never said, I don't think you quite get what's really important here. We never said that, or we never had to say, I don't know if this is really kind of an appropriate direction to sort of take this. The whole level of interest in gaining a real depth of understanding of what was really truly important here was very consistent throughout the whole process, and that's quite rare. But as I sort of formulate this thought, I also realized that approaching the project in that way, really trying to gain that depth of understanding and really live in the moment in putting this sort of project together and putting together what's basically an academic work about a company that hasn't never been created before, really parallels a lot about what makes Heath Ceramics special as well at its core, and has allowed it to continue in so many years. This is the way that Edith Heath worked. She loved materials, and she loved pottery, and that's what she lived in the moment for. And that's what brought it to be where it is today, and we have to remember that. And it's a philosophy that we still use to go ahead and continue with and run the company today and in the future. Loving the products that we make and making them special. So I'm going to introduce a couple of people and tell you a little bit about what we're going to do for the rest of the evening. This is my introduction. I'm really looking forward to listening to Garth Clark educate us even more about Heath Ceramics and Edith Heath and American pottery. He's got a lecture that he calls Edith Heath and American Dinnerware. And we'll also be hearing from Amos Klausner. Actually, we're going to hear from Amos Klausner next, who put the book together. And he's going to talk a little bit about putting the book together and that whole process, giving it a context, and then introducing Garth. And then following Garth's lecture, what I should be saying is we're going to do a Q&A. I'll let you guys ask any questions of us, as well as Adam Brosley, who's one of the designers of the book, who's joining us here tonight as well. And then after the Q&A, we're going to stay up here. And if anybody would like to get their book signed, please come up and do so at the time. So I'm going to introduce Amos and turn it over to him. Thank you.
Again, thanks for joining us at this celebration. A celebration of the life and work of Edith and Brian Heath, and one marking an important anniversary for Heath Ceramics, our 60th. When I approached Robin and Kathy back in 2005 with the idea for a small exhibition of Heathware, I was familiar with the company, but I didn't appreciate its history or its eccentricities. The first time I visited the Heath factory, it was over a decade ago, just after my wife and I had moved to Marin County. And just as Edith Heath, then in her mid-80s and always a hands-on owner, began to turn over more responsibility and day-to-day operations to her staff. I remember we had just attended an open studios at an artist collective in Sausalito, and we saw across the parking lot a funky building with ceramic letters spelling out the company name on its exterior. We weren't exactly sure what it was, but the door was open, and having just walked through plenty of open doors at the open studios, we wandered inside. I wish I could tell you that it was at that moment when I realized Heathware's intrinsic beauty, its careful craftsmanship, or the important role Heath plays in our shared design history. The truth is that the factory store we entered was piled high with so much dusty dinnerware and mismatched tile that it was hard to pick out one item from the next. There wasn't any order, and it was even a little dark and dreary. I remember thinking, this really must be the place that time forgot. I realize now that this was Heath Ceramics at a crossroads. And like time itself, I forgot about Heath too, until many years later, when I was reintroduced. As it is often with good things, it was chance. I was organizing a statewide awards show for recent graphic design. One of the winners was a San Francisco design studio named Volume. They were recognized for some rebranding work that they'd done for Heath and its new owners. I was friendly with the partners at Volume, and more importantly, I knew Heath. Looking at the collateral they'd designed, I didn't see the dust, the piles, the tired age of a mid-century half-forgotten. What I saw was beautiful ware, shaped for timeless enjoyment, shaded in the colors of Northern California. I decided to go back to the factory store. The same ceramic letters were hanging on the same wall, but inside everything had changed. Settings of classic Heath dinnerware patterns were displayed on modern tables with delicate linens. Edith's accessories, with their gentle, organic curves, were the perfect punctuation to a new Heath that was not so new at all. On this second trip, I finally saw that these shapes, the same ones that Edith had formed, remained as relevant that day as they must have over 50 years ago when they were first created. I was surprised to learn that there had been little scholarly work done in regard to Heath Ceramics. It had been included in many of the earliest exhibitions on modern American design. It had the pedigree we've come to appreciate when we recite the names of Eames, Nelson, or Wright. And Heath had graced the dinner tables of more than a handful of redwood hippies. With the owners on board and a small exhibition planned for a California museum, I sat down with the designers at Volume and asked if they'd be interested in another Heath project, one about Edith and Brian's unique contribution to post-war domesticity. It's to Volume's credit that they fashioned a book proposal so beautiful, so well crafted, that the publisher couldn't turn it down. In researching Heath, I was immersed in Edith and Brian, their personal and professional journey, the rise of Heath, ceramic chemistry and the Heath process, the family of longtime employees that kept the doors open during the hard times, and even Edith's renowned hot temper. The story is a design story. It's a story of America as opportunity and America as creative enterprise, except for the part about Edith's hot temper. In today's high-speed, object-based economy, Heathware is an anachronism. It doesn't send or receive email, and it can't play an MP3 file. It simply sits. Although in my house, it makes our terrible cooking look very good. Or should I say that it sits simply? It's consistent, not in the way each piece resembles the next. The variation between each handcrafted piece is part of the ware's charm. It's consistent in intent, in purpose, and in the role it plays bringing families and friends together for a welcome pause. Like the objects themselves, the complexity of simplicity, our book, has brought together new friends into a new family. Contributors to the book range from cutting-edge architects and industrial designers to entrepreneurs and restaurateurs. And tonight I'm happy to introduce one of them, Garth Clark. Together with Mark Del Vecchio, Garth owns and directs the leading gallery for ceramic art in New York City. He also operates a second space for large-scale sculpture and experimental work in Long Island City. Without gushing too much, Garth is the preeminent author and authority on modern and contemporary ceramic art. He is the editor, author, or contributor to nearly 40 books and the author of over 200 monographs, essays, and catalogs. He's the founding director of the Ceramic Arts Foundation, an international organization dedicated to advancing scholarship in this field, and he's won numerous awards for his achievements in art criticism, including the prestigious Mather Award presented by the College Art Association. When you've finished enjoying the complexity of simplicity, I encourage you to consider Garth's newest book, Free Spirit, The New Native American Potter. Please allow me to introduce my friend, Garth Clark.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wouldn't have thought that the book, The New Native American Potter, would have much to do with mid-century design, but as you will see, it really plays a very crucial role. I want to begin by thanking Amos. I've said this before this evening, but working with him and the Heath organization on this book, even though my role was very, very small, was really one of the most immaculate jobs of its kind. All the thank you letters arrived before we became agitated. The check arrived before we asked for it. And then out of the blue came a wonderful gift as well. It was really a marvelous organization, and one did in a strange way feel that one was being inducted into a family. I also want to thank Osvaldo da Silva and Paul Booth. If this presentation runs well, it's to their credit, but doesn't, it's my fault. And it's interesting, the title. Michael Cardew told me that he was at a soiree given by the great Bernard Leach. Well, the sort of great Bernard Leach. We have a very mixed feeling about that these days. But they were sitting, it was 1922, they were sitting at his home in St. Ives, and Bernard Leach picked up a rice bowl. It was a very simple rice bowl, very inexpensive, the kind of rice bowl actually that would have been bought by somebody like a laborer, a dock worker. And he held it up and he said, "Look at this, isn't this simple?" And in very broken English, Matsuhisa, who was the 39th generation of Asahi potters and had been sent to St. Ives to set up the kiln because the Japanese thought that Bernard Leach was an idiot when it came to technical matters, said, "No, I don't think so. I think it is very complex." And really that is so true. Minimalism comes from an extraordinary restraint, and we will see some of that in this lecture. Okay, I'll be expanding a little on the book, going into different areas. A little bit about the California ceramic scene at the time that Edith Heath arrived there, and a few other digressions. Edith Heath was born in 1911. She was born Edith Kurtzner in Ida Grove, which is about 40 miles from Sioux City, Iowa. Her parents were Danish, and they had a small farm. They tried to ride out the Depression, but just before her graduation from high school, the crash came and the family had to sell off all of its belongings. And there's a wonderful quote from her. "I was going by cart and horse 6 miles to high school. I remember driving off the morning the auction took place. It was March and it was cold and snowy, and the farmers gathered from all around for the auction. I knew that when I came home that evening, everything would be gone. The only things left were the beds, the kitchen table, some chairs, a piano, and the Haviland china." Now, the Haviland china was very shy and just seemed to disappear. There it is. The Haviland china was spared because it was considered way too luxurious an object for the local community. They didn't think anybody could afford it, so that was left in the home. Little did she know at the time that the surviving piece of sort of the family wealth, the whole concept of china, was to have such a big moment in her life. And the first time I saw the work, it's interesting. You have these instinctual relationships with objects and you look at them. And of course, as a historian, I tend to think of where things come from and their influences. And my first reaction was Scandinavian. Well, she had Danish parents, immigrants, so I got that right. And the other one was Bauhaus, but Bauhaus made no sense. How could Edith get to the Bauhaus? She was too young, and she had not left the United States, and I don't think she did leave it for several years later, but she managed to do it a different way. The Bauhaus came to her. The image on the screen is Theo Bogler. He is one of the so-called Jungmeisters, the younger masters of the pottery school at the Bauhaus. Edith left the farm in 1931. She moved to Chicago, where she joined the Chicago Normal School. Isn't that a curious title? How did we end up with a title like a normal school? We know most of us would not fit in a normal school. It later became the Chicago Teachers College. She studied there, and amongst the things she studied was art education. And then in 1937, as I say, the Bauhaus came to Edith. Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and an educator by the name of Cahill established the new Bauhaus school. The Bauhaus closed in 1933, and they reopened in the mansion of Marshall Field's home. Well, I suppose that's a bit of a redundancy, but anyway. And it was a very interesting experiment. Although the Bauhaus then spread throughout the world, Chicago was the only place where the original curriculum was practiced fairly rigidly. And she became both a teacher and a student in the various transformations. The Bauhaus went through about 5 manifestations until it was finally absorbed by another institution. There she met and married Brian Heath. And in 1941, having had an extraordinary time, because the new Bauhaus school was a magnet for all of the most exciting designers and intellectuals in the field of both applied and fine art and architecture, although the Bauhaus School actually in Chicago today is best remembered for its achievement in photography, Nathan Lerner and others. She and her husband, Brian Heath, decided to move to San Francisco, and they went by car, taking their time across the country. And somewhere along the line, they ended up at San Ildefonso, the pueblo in New Mexico. And, of course, met the queen of San Ildefonso, if you can use such a term politically within a pueblo, which is Maria Martinez, this wonderful potter who was working there at the time. And Edith Heath fell completely in love with her magical black on black decoration. In fact, it's not, well, with her pottery overall, The interesting thing, though, is Maria never once decorated a part. The parts were all done by her husband, Julian. And it's really strange. We always talk about Maria Martinez pottery, but it's a two-person operation. Very simple work, beautifully crafted. The decoration there you see is the Mimbres feather decoration, which goes back about 1,000 years to the Mimbres potters. She did do her own work which was undecorated, and that piece is rather interesting because there's an element in that piece of Edith Heath's later designs. So eventually, driving cross country, they get to San Francisco and they arrive to find the beginnings of a revolution. California, God bless it, had just discovered the wheel. Clearly not the one for automobiles, but the one for potters. And nobody could throw until really into the mid-30s. Most of the work was done by slab or molding. This is the work of Laura Andresen. Laura Andresen was a professor at UCLA where she taught ceramics. She couldn't throw, but she heard that Carlton Ball could. He was at Mills College in Northern California. So she sent a student up every week. The student would go, Carlton Ball would give her lessons, she would come back and give Laura lessons, and the next week she'd go back up and the rest of it, and she learned to throw that way. Other people up there, Marguerite Wildenhain, who you think would have really have been a great asset for the Heath factory. This is a design she did shortly after she left the Bauhaus. Interesting because she was one of the original students of the Bauhaus pottery in Germany. A very beautiful porcelain piece that she did, I think, 1936 for Berlin Porcelain. And initially the work that she did was still very much within the aesthetic of the Bauhaus, but Marguerite Wildenhain eventually turned very, very much against the Bauhaus. She described it to me as that awful and soulless institution. And you, perhaps looking at that piece, don't feel the change. Later on, she began to be inspired by folk pottery, patterns, decorations, flowers, figurative stuff, really, to put it bluntly, awful, sentimental pottery. She was not a figure to be casual with, however. She was incredibly tough. And she lived on the edge of, actually in a national park next to Russian River. And the federal government managed to remove everybody from that park except her. They eventually gave up and allowed her to be the only person to live there. So until her death, she lived there more or less alone, except for her summer times, making pottery and sleeping with the bears. You know, you didn't respond very well to that. Those lines are thrown in to see whether anybody is still awake. And quite patently, it is a stupid remark because the bears were way too terrified to sleep with Marguerite Wildenhain. I remember going to visit her once and interviewing her in the mid-70s, and she sort of treated me like an unwanted dog that was not house-trained. Stomped around me after me in her studio, insulting me and commenting and making unpleasant remarks. And while I was there at her white picket fence, and yes, in the middle of a national park, she had a white picket fence, the editor, Jerry Williams of Studio Potter, turned up. He had just driven 7.5 hours from Los Angeles to interview her. And she went to the gate, and he explained it to her, and she said, "I don't care how long you took. Your magazine is stupid, and I will not see you." And she turned around and walked away. And poor Jerry had to leave, and then she returned to where she had left off, telling me that I was stupid and that I obviously was an art critic in the way that I handled her pots. Now, I could have been unkind and said the pot I was handling was probably one of the worst thrown pots I've handled in a long time, but I was way too refined for that. In her later work, the pieces really had lost their edge. But she is a bit of a cult figure. People who like really authoritarian teachers loved her. And one of her things was, one of her rules, absolute rules, was if you throw, your butt may not lift off the seat. You have to throw, you always have to keep your seat on the seat. And the way she did this was she would patrol up and down, because she ran a little summer school and people would come and learn to make pots. She would patrol up and down behind them with a basket of wet sponges. And as your hiney lifted up, she would slip the sponge underneath. So there, more than you ever wanted to know about Marguerite Wildenhain. The point being that, as I say, her direction was very different. She wasn't really working in the same style. Antonio Prieto, very influential part of working at this time. It was a very exciting time. California was just beginning to discover ceramics. The movement ceramics had really been more of an East Coast activity in the arts and crafts fin de siècle period. But California was now starting to edge towards that moment of real revolution. The work of the Nutzlers, of course, wonderful potters, came from Austria. Early functional wares by Beatrice Wood, who was then living and working in Ojai. And really the wonderful work of Glenn Lukens. I think in some ways when I think of a kindred spirit for Edith, it's Glenn Lukens. I don't know what she thought about his work, whether she liked it or not, but both of them had this wonderful elemental way of working with clay. He would go into Death Valley, collect rocks, make his extraordinary glazes from very raw materials that were somewhat unpredictable in the firing. He was also the organizer in 1938 of the All California Ceramic Art Exposition, which brought together this community as a cohesive group for the first time for an exhibition in San Diego. And from that point on, it began to evolve. So when Edith arrived, she was coming into really quite an active, fairly literate ceramic community in the Bay Area and overall in California. Another very beautiful piece of Lukens. Interesting thing about him is that Lukens taught at USC, and his technical assistant was a man by the name of Frank Gehry. And one day, for whatever reason, Lukens said to him that there was a program on architecture that he thought would be good for him. He actually paid for Gehry to go to that. So as far as I'm concerned, the ceramic world owns Frank Gehry. And now we get to the work of Edith herself. Now bear in mind, she didn't arrive a potter. Pottery was actually not part of the Bauhaus curriculum in Chicago. She began to learn when she got to San Francisco. You can still see in her throne work, though, the genesis of what is going to be her aesthetic. It is a little more geometric, less organic in a sense, although I'm sure she would argue with me. To draw attention to her part, she hired as her technical assistant Doris Day, the movie actress, seen here cleaning buckets in her studio. Are you sure you're awake out there? I'm not really... No, but isn't it remarkable? She looks so much like Doris Day. The photograph was about 1947-48, which is the time that the first Doris Day film came out. And of course, it's not that she looked like Doris Day. That was just the aesthetic, the look, the hair, the style of the time. But then Edith Heath was a very glamorous and very stylish woman. Her ceramics were interesting on many levels. She, aside from the work that you've seen, she also had a very interesting early kind of architectural form, which is very strong, very powerful, not very much like the other pottery being made at the time. She began to get very successful. By 1944, she had a solo exhibition at the California Legion of Honor. It's a longer title than that, but it'll do today, the California Fine Arts Museums. And so within a period of 4 years, she'd gone from somebody seeing the work of Maria Martinez wanting to become a potter to having a fairly major exhibition in San Francisco. And she began to show at Gumps, or sell through Gumps and others, and the orders began to pour in. And she was really a wonderfully pragmatic Scandinavian woman at heart, and it didn't take her long to work out that she alone on the wheel could not begin to supply the orders, and probably several people on the wheels could not supply the orders. So she decided to make a terrible deal with the devil and open a factory in Sausalito. I assume most of you don't know the early history of Marin County when it was covered in. Now, there's a reason for this, and I'll get back to it, but it was, to the potters in California, a terribly controversial decision. She was banned from showing her work at America House because she was now going to use industrial techniques. And the San Francisco Association of Potters, or Potters Association, of which she was one of the founders, began to suggest to her that she should no longer be a member because she wasn't working by hand. In fact, this is a little bit of a fib. Sausalito really looks like that. And the factory was very charming, the second one in particular, that in 1960 really had a lovely quality about it. But there was a reason for putting that slide up, and that is that we are now going to look a little bit at what happened with modern pottery, modern ceramic design in America at this period in the mid-40s. And of course, there was never much of a ceramic tradition industrially in America. There are some factories, but it was never a great thing because of what you see on the screen. That is Stoke-on-Trent, Staffordshire, England, this powerhouse of industrial production, making more china than China. It was the largest center of ceramic production anywhere in the world, enormously efficient, enormously effective, very inexpensive. It was $5 for a 48-piece dinner service. It was not something which people could easily compete with. Things improved a little bit after the war, though, because after the war, British tableware manufacturers were not allowed to use any color or any decoration because of the war recovery effort, and they didn't want them using valuable oxides and things which were needed maybe for more urgent things. So it left a little bit of a gap. So the way I want to approach this really is to go to this point, 1947-48, when Edith Heath and her husband Brian, who was the business and organizational and at times technical genius behind the enterprise, decided to open their pottery. And imagine what a bride wanting to buy a modern American-made dinner service had to offer them. Now, let's face it, look at those people. They would never buy a modern dinner service. They have Royal Dalton written all over them. So let's find something a little more stylish there. A 1952 issue of Modern Bride, much more the kind of woman who'd be going out looking for something chic and elegant and today to put on her table. And if she went out looking, she wanted to buy American dinnerware, she had few choices. Fiesta was one. Fiesta was designed by one of the sort of major figures from the arts and crafts movement, actually, Frederick Hurton Reed. It kind of looks modernist, but if you look at it closely, it's not. Particularly when you look at the ad, you see those creamers and the rest of it. You can find those forms in English ceramics, 1912, 1915. The form is not that modernist. They've done a little bit of the engine turning look on the forms, and it's slightly modern, but the forms are really not. What is modern about it is two things. We're talking about 1937 now, the first time an American manufacturer really offers dinnerware to the American public that seems to be of its time. And of course, what was modern was the color and the ability to mix and match. But the 800-pound gorilla of this period is Russell Wright, an American modern. This was the most extraordinary success story. He took Steubenville Pottery, which was on the point of collapse, turned it into a very vital organization. It collapsed anyway eventually, but that's another story. But for a long time, it was enormously successful. The work was done in millions and millions of units. It was avidly followed. Buyers would line up 3-4 hours before stores opened, when the word went out that a new shipment of Russell Wright had come in. You had like a frequent flyer program. You had a little card. When you bought stuff, they clipped it, and if you had X number of pieces that you'd bought, you got a free plate or something. The promotion was extraordinary. The response was extraordinary. America had never had a homegrown service like this, and in many ways it was very beautiful. It comes out of a very specific kind of organic modernism. And the service was also made in miniature scale in plastics, so that the wife could buy the dinner service and her daughter could have the plastic surface for play teas and dinner as well. An enormous success, and with it came glassware and table coverings and all kinds of other things. It was really about a transformation of lifestyle. It's very interesting work, but it sort of reminds me of something, and this is going to get me into trouble for saying this, but that America is not so much a nation of designers, they're a nation of stylists. Europe, on the other hand, is very much a nation of designers. They go deeply into the meaning of things, into its history, into why things work, into how people eat, how ergonomics work, and there is a very, very different relationship between the two. The other option you had were the wonderful designs of Eva Zeisel. Also a remarkable designer, less of a modernist though. You can feel the Art Deco touch. There's a slight Baroque edge to her work, a kind of theatricality that I don't think the modernists would entirely have approved of. And there you see one of her pieces in her own hands. She's now approaching 101 and she's still designing. So, if we go back to that attractive bride, not the terrible couple in the bad clothing, but the really chic one, what is she going to get from Heath? Heath is now opening a factory. In 1948, they come out with their first line, Coupe. If you really want to dress it up, you can call it Coupe. 1948, it really is a remarkable design. You look at this now, it is difficult to pinpoint the time. There are certain things about it. I mean, there are little giveaways. The handle, for instance, that sort of elongated handle, is very much a kind of late 40s, early 50s kind of device. Here and there you can spot things, and I like the fact that in small ways the service tells you where it came from, what its age is, and that it's unapologetic about it and at the same time ageless. It offered the same opportunities to mix and match, use different colors, and became rather a wonderful success. It turned up in all kinds of journals, publications. It was featured in the Good Design exhibition in 1951 at the Museum of Modern Art. It was shown in Sweden, shown in Paris, and turned up on any number of Nest publications throughout the United States. Yeah, here's a kind of smile that would make a cannibal scared. And then things begin to change. They begin to change very dramatically. As you can see with the studio pottery that was happening in California at that time, the aesthetic was not really that different to the work of Heath. Her work was a little more refined, a little more precise. But there was an overall aesthetic into which it fit. And then we have things begin to change. The California clay revolution really takes loose. Volkas moves up to the Bay Area from Otis in 1959. Otis he joins in 1954. He seemed harmless enough. These are his early works. This is done 1947, 1948, the same year that Heath opened her factory. But then in the late 50s, things begin to change very dramatically. The pots get ripped, torn, covered in epoxy. Lead is trickled into them. Color, asymmetry. It becomes pretty wild. Arneson starts showing toilets. The whole thing is a very different scene to the one that the Heaths found when they moved there. But in amongst all this noise, Heath still chose quiet. 1960, things are going a little crazy, and out comes her second design, Room. And she only did 3 designs, by the way, at least for Heath. It reminds me of my introduction and that embarrassing number of writings that I have. I read something by a writer whose name I can no longer remember. Unfortunately, I've Googled it and couldn't find it. But he was 80 years old, and he said, if I knew I was going to live this long, I would have written less. And she got that right from the beginning. Each one of her designs was really extraordinary. She didn't overwork it. Room is really very beautiful. It's gracious. It's a very expansive design. It was aimed at the restaurant market in particular. It was sort of simple, and yet it was very bold, but with that kind of modesty that we find in most of her work. And again, the giveaway is again the handles. The handles are the one things that tell us that it's maybe a 60s or maybe even a 70s design, but it does put a certain date on it. Then there's a little bit of discussion about this. Klauser was designed somewhere between 1980 and 1992. I'm sure that the numbers will get much closer later on, but either way, round about the age of 81, with restrained still as a métier, she came across with this design with the mixture of the circle and the square. Again, a very beautiful, elegant, and probably the most informal of her designs. She would argue that, but we will get to it in a moment. They did a few other designs as well. She did a design for a restaurant in San Francisco, and she also did this design in 1964 for Wedgwood. But the 3 designs for Heath are still in production. Now, I don't want you to go away with the feeling that she was this terribly restrained lady who just made very, very beautiful, very quiet, very Zen-like dinner services. Edith Heath had a very wild side, and you didn't see it in the dinnerware, you saw it in the tiles. There she could really play with color, with forms, with textures, and tile became a very important and very visible part of what the Heath pottery was doing. I won't go into this in great detail, but it's an important part of the work, and certainly we need to take a brief look at it. It's the Norton Simon Museum that you're looking at. Very well. And a remarkable moment in her career, because she gets given the AIA, the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal, the first time ever in that association's history that it was given to a non-architect, for this really extraordinary and still wonderful, the building of course is still there, use of tile. And, through interiors, through artworks, this is Rupert Garcia's work at the San Francisco International Airport, homes. I love these tiles. These were actually not designed by her. They were designed by Leon Galetto, a French ceramist. But he was an alumnus of the Saxbo Pottery in Denmark, which in a way is almost like, not intentionally, but just by the nature of their work, like the sister organization. Their work was very similar and had the same impact in Denmark on design that Heath's work had here. That you can visit here. This is the Maritime Hotel in Chelsea. That is Azzy, a restaurant in San Francisco. And of course, the rule of any slide lecture is always try and get somebody slightly unclothed into the lecture, no matter what the subject is. This is the Cranbrook Athletic Center. William and Sean are the architects, two very famous architects with which she collaborated on a number of projects. But let's go back to the dinnerware. You have to understand that this is not dinnerware made in a true factory tradition. And it's interesting to look back to 1948 and to see how she was considered a terrible traitor, moving from the primacy of the hand into the devilry of the machine. And yet, when you look at the book and you look at the pictures, every piece is being handled again and again and again. There is so much handwork. What it really is a craftsman's factory. Because today what happens in ceramic factories is very different. The pieces are dry formed, they are shot out of a machine onto a conveyor belt, glazed, and 3 hours later they're fired. They are not touched at any point, and it is just a completely extraordinary experience. Here in this factory, there's still a tremendous attention to the details and the finesse. Yes, they don't throw by hand, they use other devices, but they use devices which actually were being used in the 18th century by Josiah Wedgwood, a little updated, but still the same technology. And I want to close with 2 quotes, one because I disagree with her, and the other because I agree with her and think the quote should actually be stenciled into stone and be put in front of the Museum of Art and Design. I don't like highly stylized things. I like things that are easy, soft shapes that are more like folk dance as compared with ballet. In ballet, you're up on your toes all the time, and that's extremely disciplined. I don't think the American way of life was that disciplined. People are much more easygoing, more humane, and less concerned with status. In other words, I was trying to do something that was more egalitarian than aristocratic. Well, the last part of that statement is correct. The pieces have a kind of earthiness about them, sort of like work that would be wonderful for a super sophisticated peasant. But, and when you see it spread out on a wooden picnic table, of course, it carries that thought as well. But then when you look at the pieces in isolation, folk dance, honey, no, I don't agree. There, in fact, is exactly the element she said isn't in there, that sense of classical ballet. Classical ballet is about perfection of line. And what else do you see on the screen at the moment but that? And, I don't want to push the point too much because I think it's quite self-evident, but if you take those 2 bowls and turn them over, you have tutus. The second quote is the one I really love, and I think that every functional potter in America should have left their wheels today and been here to hear this one paragraph. Good design doesn't depend on whether something is made by hand. In fact, there are some very junky things that can be made by hand. The idea of making things on a potter's wheel in an industrial society really was an anachronism as far as I was concerned. It was okay while I was learning and getting a feel for the clay. But after all, a machine doesn't decide what the shape is going to be. A human being has to decide that. So I felt I was as much in control as ever. And certainly that is in the work. I mean, if you look at the softness, you look at the way the materials have been used, there really is no difference between the aesthetic quality in these pieces and the aesthetic quality in really beautifully produced hand pottery. I've always thought that a kind of obsessive fascination with the hand, and she's right, a hand can do much uglier things than a machine, is misplaced, not because one should or shouldn't work with it, but to give it a kind of moral superiority over an industrially made thing is simply just not intellectually acceptable. And so there we have a very brief picture into a remarkable life. I never met her. I now wish I had. She made 3 dinner services. All 3 are still in production. Coop started in 1948. It's going to have its 60th birthday next year. The business is now moving on with Kathy and Robert into all kinds of new and unexplored zones. And the fact that the factory exists is kind of a miracle at a time when most American dinnerware factories have long since closed shop. And the quality of the presence of the work is unaltered, because when you're buying a piece today, you're buying almost exactly the same piece you would have bought in 1948. And I look now at some of the unhappy reissues of some of Eva Zeisel's work. Not all of it, some of it came across very well, a lot of it didn't. And the terrible exercise in trying to bring American Moderne back, which was clunky and awful and completely missed the spirit of the original work. So here we have work which has never lost that spirit, never lost that integrity, never lost its authorship. And then you add to this Heath's remarkable achievement in architecture. And one has a success story in ceramics and design which is really quite without parallel in America. It is a life quietly lived, but wonderfully celebrated through clay. Thank you very much.
We'll now invite Kathy and Robin, Garth, and Adam Broadsley from Volume to join us here on stage. And this is when we invite you to become part of our family, and we ask you what questions you might have about Heath Ceramics.
Well, Garth, you did a beautiful, beautiful presentation. I greatly enjoyed it. And I wanted to just ask you, hinted that the factory would be changing or moving in new directions. And so I wanted to ask the two new owners about the new directions and whether you were going to focus more on tile, which was just hinted at in terms of the breadth of tile. I think one of the great places in the city that has your tiles, the bathroom at the Folk Art Museum, so we should be seeing more of it, and whether it be simple like that or more complex. But I was wondering if that is in your future plans.
Me to talk. Well, to answer the question about tile, what's interesting about Heath is it's always been known for dinnerware. Dinnerware kind of has this natural way of getting more attention than tile. This is kind of more, and you don't think about tile because you don't eat off of it 3 times a day. Maybe it's that simple. You walk on it, maybe you don't look at it enough. But so the answer to that question is we are focusing more on tile, but at the same time, Heath has been making tile for decades. And what we found being quite remarkable is a lot of people that have known Heath dinnerware for decades are just finding out that Heath ever made tile in the first place. And they say, "Oh, you make tile now." No, we've actually been making tile for almost 40 years. So it is becoming more and more of something that we want to focus on and expose people to, but yet it's not brand new. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I'll say,
You can tell me and I'll tell everybody. Yeah, that's okay.
I can talk a little bit maybe. But one thing I think that's important is we don't want to be only a historical company. We feel that we have this amazing place where we're able to design with a factory on site, and we think that should yield current work as well. But that doesn't mean we will not continue to make Edith's work. But we don't think that should be the only thing that we should be doing. So you'll still see all the original work being produced for as long as people want to buy it. But we will try, and we do have a new line that we've been working on for the last few years. And it's out now, and you can see it. It's very different than probably what Edith would have done, but it's still very Heath in many ways. And we worked on that line with Alice Waters and a designer whose name is Christina Kim. And both people that I think Edith would have really admired for different reasons. But we're trying to move forward and keep the past alive.
I think what's important to add to that is that even though Edith is not there and we are moving forward doing new designs and new things, the very important thing to remember is that the form is there. We're not changing the nature by which new things get developed and created or the philosophy behind that. So doing new things is great, because you're going to come up with similar results because you're keeping that form intact. the fact that we still have our factory there, and we're keeping that factory as part of our manufacturing is inspirational to our development. And those are the kind of things that are going to reap you consistently, because results are consistently in line with what she was producing.
One other thing to add to that is when we develop new products, we do it completely the opposite of the way Robin and I had designed products before. We start off by throwing the products, not us ourselves, but that's an important part of it. We don't start off with CAD. So in the spirit of the way Edith would have done it, I think we try to learn some of the things that make things Heath, and a lot of that about the product development is about working with the original material, not using new technology, except for where it can really, it can add something to the way we produce it.
I'm interested a little bit in the history and the marketing of it, because as we saw its competitors, Garth, as you spoke of American Modern, and you spoke of Eva Zeisel's work and and Fiesta even, and then you get Heath coming into the marketplace, and it's stoneware, so it's different. I'm interested to know why she decided on that. Was it work? Is it purely aesthetic? Was it economic? And how was it received when it was introduced to the marketplace?
In my opinion, I think it was aesthetic. I know that she developed the stoneware clay for its look and also its function. It's very strong, and so it achieved the functionality that she wanted. But I know that the particular brown clay we still use, she developed for its look and its feel and its texture.
I wanted to ask you about your comment about not using CAD for design, and it kind of has two parts. One, if people know if Edith had any opinion about putting digital technology into clay design. Maybe she didn't have an opportunity to do it herself, but as a person that did decide to move to a different kind of tool, and that tool informed her imagination and her design, I'm wondering why you're deciding that if you're working in the spirit of Edith Heath, you wouldn't want to try to see a new tool inspire the design.
Well, I think that's kind of a personal decision for me because I have worked that way, and I feel like working with CAD, you're not able to understand the material as much as working with the actual material. And in this case, we're able to work with the actual material. A lot of materials you work in CAD with, you're not able to do that. So it's an appropriate material to work with in the way that we're working with. So there's no reason to use CAD when you're working with clay, something that you can form with your hands, and you have the ability to do that in your studio. I don't think it gains you anything. You can do it instantly. There's a few instances you can talk to where CAD seems appropriate.
I love this topic because I spent a lot of time working in CAD, and a couple of things. First of all, CAD has nothing to do with designing anything but CAD. Same way, in a lot of ways, Photoshop has nothing to do with designing anything but Photoshop.
Actually, I mean, it's the general digital technology option, not necessarily CAD.
Well,
For example, if you print a 3D model,
right,
it's hard to make in clay a 3D model, but if you print an idea, then you can figure out how to do it.
But in the process of developing it, digital tools don't have anything to do with clay. They're not clay. Right. You can't really repeat clay unless you're using clay. So what we do is when we do design, I'll give you another different example. This is just purely my opinion on CAD. Little headsets for cell phones are all of a sudden almost everybody has one. I've been seeing them around a lot lately. And that's what I used to draw in CAD. And I used to spend, bill my clients 24 hours to work on this one tiny corner of getting that curve right. That now I see is it's this big. I can't even see that thing. And the whole idea just kind of seems ridiculous, because what I was drawing had nothing to do with what was really the result, the ultimate result. And in working with clay, that's yet even more apparent. So the way that we do use digital technology in a way, but the way our process works in designing new things is we hand throw, because we do want to be informed by how the clay reacts, how it works.
Also, once it's produced, it's spinning. it's something that's spinning on a jigger machine, which is similar to hand throwing. So it has another tie to that method, and I think that's important.
Mm-hmm.
But again,
but also it when we design it, then we archive it. When the designers say we do a CAD drawing, we archive it so that we have a record. But clay also has some very interesting properties that are maybe different from some other materials. When you throw a shape, or even when we jigger a shape, the way we make things, you're throwing one shape. After it dries, it turns into another shape. After it fires, it turns into yet another shape. And so why be so precise? Because you're always going to be starting off with a specific idea that you're going to have to let go of a little bit. So it's a somewhat inappropriate tool. And even when you're hand throwing it, different clays react in different ways. Our clay happens to be not very good at standing up in thin, delicate forms. It will fall. It won't even make it to the firing. So you need to know that, and you know that from hand throwing it and feeling it and moving it in certain directions and knowing whether or not it's gonna want to do that. So you kind of have to do what the clay wants to do, and that's why working in that material directly is very important. And I think Garth could probably talk about that. I think probably that's one of the his comments about why the reissue of out here
Russell Wright.
Why did that not work? I'm really curious now. I really want to understand how they designed that reissue and what they perhaps did not get about clay.
There's a danger with CAD and the whole thing that you will have everything designed on a computer. And so there'll be a certain sameness regardless of material, because the computer is leading the design, not the material. Philip Rawson, a very wonderful writer about ceramics, said that we are a culture in danger of tactile castration, which is a nice hard edge to put on it. But he said that we're losing a lot of things. We lose a sense of the chain of where food comes. We don't want to see, chickens' heads scuffled and things like that. Everything removes us one step away. And I think that relying too much on computer design takes us one step away from the actual touch and the feel and certain realities. It's probably very good for certain kinds of engineering where you're creating little widgets that fit into bigger widgets that are part of a yet bigger widget. That's very different. But when you're doing things that people are going to touch. We had a cup benefit, and Gloria Steinem gave us a cup for the benefit, which was broken. It was her coffee cup. She'd used it for 20 years. And what we did was we got Matt, a friend of ours who's a potter, to put the handle back on with gold, and it was very lovely. And then she wrote a note with it that said 20 years of love not forgotten. And it was given to her by the woman who wrote The Color Purple. So in this piece was so much love and history. For 20 years she had held this mug and drunk from it. So one does worry that the more we get disassociated from the process of making on those kind of objects, there are a lot of kind of objects where it doesn't matter because you're not in contact with them. So I think what they're doing is really kind of wonderful. They're going against the grain. They're not approaching it. Some people would say it's old-fashioned, but I don't think it is. I think there's something very real about the direction the factory's going.
Yeah, it's really what people are responding to as well. I think that it doesn't need that digital aspect. I think it's the authenticity that is what people respond to.
It's not that, there are a lot of good tools out there, and it's all choosing about what's appropriate, really. It's kind of that simple in a way. It's about appropriateness.
But actually, in my question, there was a different assumption, and that is that she, as many designers that were modern and from the arts and crafts at the time, were in tune with technology. Mm-hmm. So I was curious how you would translate that into, and I was suggesting that perhaps, for example, it would be possible that she would be interested in how the digital technology can inform her design imagination. Not necessarily to take that and exclude that. Not that I don't understand that the clay has its own character, but I was just curious about her opinion and you as designers, how you, in spirit, stay open that same way.
Well, one clue might be that 3.5 years ago when I first walked in the Heath building, I found a beautiful collection of antique IBM Selectric typewriters, which were the only technology used for writing in the whole place. And I later learned that there was a computer there once, and she called them those damn TVs. So that might be a clue. I mean, I think that she was in tune with appropriate technology. I think that she understood the essence of things.
Also, if you look at her technology in the factory, she didn't use any new technology in the factory. What apparently her husband was very good at was adapting old technology to do new things. But as I say, just about every technique they used in that factory was used by Wedgwood in the late 18th century. It was not it was innovative in some ways, but it wasn't innovative in primary technology. She didn't go down that route much at all.
Well, I think I can't talk at all. Web stuff. I mean, just different technology.
I don't understand the thought. Anyway, obviously it's a fruitful discussion topic.
Let's take another question.
Did you guys meet Edith Heath, and did she have any requests or any direction to as to what she wanted done with the factory?
Yeah, I mean, Heath Ceramics struggled for many years, as Amos alluded to, and she was quite sick in her last 10 to 15 years or so of her life, and she wasn't involved with the factory at all after, I think, the early 90s. And so she wasn't really creating, she wasn't running the business. Her husband was sick, and he passed away in 2001. He passed in 99, one of those years, quite a bit earlier. So our interaction, and part of the reason, it was going downhill, but it never transferred. She didn't really have any direct family, and she didn't want to sell it because it was the only thing in her life. It was her baby, to use a tired phrase. And so she didn't want to let it go because she was afraid of what it would turn into. I think that probably becomes obvious after you learn about her. We met her very briefly after we took over the company. We were very fortunate to have, and these things just kind of all work out. When there's a remarkable place, there's remarkable people. And one of the remarkable people was a woman that was the daughter of some of Edith and Brian Heath's really good friends. And in lieu of having children, she was kind of ended up being their caretaker and the trustee of their estate, who wanted more than anything to make sure that it transferred in good hands. So that's how it happened that we took over the business. When we met her very briefly, she was ill. She was suffering from dementia in her later years. So there were no conversations with her directly, but we do know she was very nervous about it being passed on. And Jay Stewart, the trustee I alluded to, told us that a couple of weeks after the company had been sold, Edith was still very worried about what was going on. She'd met us, and we were introduced to the people that bought your factory. And Edith asked her several weeks later or several months later, what's happening at the factory? And Jade said, well, the people that came over the other day, they bought it. And she said, oh, what do they make there? And, what do they make there? She's terrified that we were making something else. We weren't making her things. And Jay told her, they're making your designs. And as we still are, the same three patterns that were developed there. And after that, Jay told us that she had reached a certain calmness she kind of had, things were settled at that point. She was content. Her designs were still going to continue to be made. So that's the story there.
Are you still firing to a low temperature? Because she obviously did that for a reason of economy, and now it's tremendously good because it's a green world and should.
Right. We are still firing our clay bodies at low temperature. They are, people are still, potters are still amazed at the formula that it can do that. And essentially, there are three kinds of clay bodies. There's earthenware, stoneware, and porcelain. And they're denoted by their levels of durability and their levels of firing temperatures, low to high. in both senses, durability and fire and temperatures. And she, out of economy and thriftiness, developed a stoneware clay body, the functionality of stoneware, what makes the tiles be so durable and non-porous, but fired at the temperatures of earthenware. So it's quite a technical accomplishment, and done to, as Amos alluded to, save money.
Is it a cone 6 porcelain or?
Well, it's a stoneware body, and it's actually at an 03.
But what about the porcelain?
We don't do a porcelain. No porcelain, just stonewares. Yeah.
The part that I'm completely stuck on is the 3 design parts. My husband and I are American dinnerware designers and manufacturers, and we feel constant pressure from the industry twice a year to come out with as much new stuff as possible from the media and from all of the stores. And I'm just wondering, and I'm stuck on it, how there's just 3 designs. It's blowing my mind.
Good question.
Yeah, we just didn't want to fall into that because I designed footwear for a while, so it was even worse. You just can't. But we try to do new things. We almost try and play tricks where we'll do a new glaze, we'll do something, we'll do some beautiful photographs, and so people want to talk about it. And we try to keep doing beautiful things, but so that we don't spend all of our time and energy just doing things for that purpose. And we still have that attitude that the things do continue to sell, and it has a classicness that I think we're very lucky to have, but we don't want to do that for that pressure. It's not the right pressure. At the same time, we still have to continue to do new things. But color and having the ability to constantly do new colors is fantastic, and you can use that.
Right, I agree. I just know that in the last 10 years, that I've watched in the industry, especially since 9/11, I've watched interiors just grow into this mass conglomerate, just gigantic, and people, their home is so important to them now that it's changing almost as quickly as fashion. And
yeah,
I find that challenging and frustrating, and I would so much like to, I'm going to take a big part of this back to the studio with me.
I don't know. It also depends on your personal business. We try and grow very slowly, and we have, I think modest goals and slow growth so that we don't have to do that. If we really had different goals, we would have to grow much faster, make more new things. And we also are very concerned about how many things people buy and how long they last. And one of the things that we think a sustainable kind of direction that's important is to make something that's going to last a lifetime, and you shouldn't be installing tile that you're going to get tired of, and it should last 50 to 100 years. So
and also we
just one more thing. If the business is small enough, there's enough people out there that you can sell to different people and keep a small niche, and you can have your growth and make a sustainable business. And so far for us that's working by trying not to be too big.
We sell a lot of a product ourselves. We sell directly a lot. So, the people that are telling us what to make are us. And we turn down a lot. We've turned down quite a few offers to sell our product from bigger chains because we've been through that before. We've been through those kind of meetings with sales executives and Kathy in particular and her experiences adding footwear. You start selling to somebody like that, and the next thing you know, they're going to start saying, okay, you're giving us this, but we want this because we did a focus group. And, we're just not interested. And if that's the price you pay to want to get huge and make a lot of money, then it's not worth it.
I think that's also a decision you have to make as to whether you want to design fashion or design classics. And I know often the marketplace doesn't actually give you a form and you tick off one or the other. There's just the pressure to do so. But my partner Mark just came back from trying to clean up his mother's attic and garage, and he found a magazine from 1956, 59. 1947, okay. And it had this big color spread on chairs. It was very funny because it's very much of the time. They'd taken all the chairs out onto the beach. So the water flowing around all over the place was very stylish at the time. But the interesting thing is every one of the chairs in that feature are still in production today. And that's
1967. Sorry.
Oh, see, he's a very, very unreliable source of dates. Either way, they're still all in production and very successful designs. So you've got to be careful in what you allow the manufacturers to push you into, because if you start becoming grist for this fashion mill, you've got a 6-month shelf life and then it's all over.
But isn't it a difference of you don't design and manufacture? You do both. You actually manufacture it as well.
You need to sell.
Because Russell, Wright, and Eva Zeisel were designers who worked independently, and somebody else manufactured, and all of them got abused in the long run.
I'm so fascinated because this is a very rare, for something that's still, hip and sustainable, and people my age are buying it all up. I was just at a bridal shower this past weekend, and she's 30 and got all Heath on her registry. It was amazing. I'm so envious. But this is very, in the industry, this is very, very rare. Besides, Ava Zeisel and Nambe and,
The stores get tired of selling. They want to have a fresh look every season, so they don't want to have the same merchandise.
But those designers fall by the wayside. I
It's
sell
so
jewelry,
true.
and I'll tell you, Ted Muelling, the people who have done the same jewelry forever with simplicity, who is the stylist. It's what she said. You said something about stylist. That was a great line. And the thing is, magazines need to show something new all the time. Don't let them dictate to you. And you can start a new trend by saying, let's get back to classic, things you don't need. You can have this for 30 years, and like, Gloria Steinem's cup, there's your emotion in it. So use that spin and give it back to them.
You know what?
Trust me, they'll be like, wow, what a great new idea. You can have it for 30 years.
You know what? Ted Muelling. Thanks for bringing up Ted Muelling. Ted Muelling is another great example of that.
We have time for one more question.
I was wondering about glaze application. If you could talk a little bit about the processes you use to apply glazes, maybe hand versus machine processes.
Well, a lot of our glazes are formulated from natural oxides, which the natural oxides are going to have a lot of variability in them. You don't know exactly how they're going to react. And on top of that, they are sprayed, they're hand sprayed onto each piece using a spray gun. It atomizes the glaze. And the way a glaze is applied affects the way it looks when it's finally fired, the amount of glaze that goes on a piece. And it blows me away what our glazers are able to do, because we might do about 80, we probably do about 20 glazes on a regular rotation, and then we have a lot of other glazes. We do about 80 different tile glazes on a regular rotation. But almost each one of these glazes has what's called a different weight. It has to go on with a different weight. It's literally, you weigh the piece when it's just raw clay, and then you spray it, and then you weigh it again when there's glaze on it, and it's a couple of grams of glaze. Each one has a different weight. On each different shape has a different weight. So think about how many combinations they need to learn and train their arms to be able to have that physical memory to apply that in a consistent manner day in, day out. It's quite remarkable. And that gives it, the range of, every piece is a little bit different. Every piece has got a little bit of a personality.
It also gives us a lot of seconds. And one other really smart thing that Edith did is she started selling the seconds directly, originally on a barge, because we're right by the water. Later, when they had the factory finished, she started selling from the factory. And we sell all these seconds direct. It's a fantastic business. People love it. And it's one of the reasons that Heath actually stayed around, was because they had this little business selling seconds directly. So good margin. It's fantastic. And some of the stuff ends up being more beautiful because it's, it's a little different.
It's because she had her philosophy that everything was beautiful when it had its individuality. So it wasn't really a second to her. It was just a little bit different and maybe something somebody else didn't want.
Before we break, the inner salesman in me needs to tell you that books are still available upstairs, and any one of our panelists would be happy to sign a book if you decide to purchase one. And so our thanks to you for joining us this evening, to Garth especially for his presentation.